Welcome everyone in this room as well as on our live stream at home to our first adult education program for the year. I am thrilled with our entire fall programming. We are trying to do some things that fit with our sermon series, Detectives of Divinity. You will see, if you have a chance, at the back of the room, if you'd like a paper copy, there is all of the fall upcoming events, September and October. It doesn't go through December, but September and October. If you would like to grab that at the back to know, it's also all on our website. But I am thrilled to be able to continue our detectiveness. I don't actually think that's the right word, but detecting the divine in adult education. And so I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Eric Barreto, who is the Frederick and Margaret Weyerhaeuser Associate Professor of New Testament at Princeton Seminary. He's here to help us detect the divine in looking at some of the stories of miracles and exorcisms of Jesus in the New Testament. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, friends. Thanks for being here. Good thanks for the online folks as well. As Jamie said, I was asked to speak about miracles today and how we might detect the divine in them. To start there, I want to take one step back and think about the gospel stories themselves, to remind ourselves that the gospels are narratives. They're stories. That's where the New Testament begins, with these 4 stories about Jesus. But we might wonder why the gospel writers chose this path. Why did they tell stories instead of giving us a list of instructions, telling us exactly what to do and when to do it? Jesus, give us your best hits, your best sermons. We'll write those down. Gospel writers don't do that. Instead, they give us these stories that shape us, stories that teach us, stories that inspire us, and yes, sometimes stories that baffle us. We don't quite know what to do with. And this is, I think, where the miracle stories come in. Some of these powerful narratives just don't make sense to us sometimes. We're not quite sure what to do with them and what they might mean. When Jesus and the disciples do extraordinary things that we don't see happen every day, we wonder what to make of them. And here we are dealing with miracles. So I want to invite you this morning to wonder within yourself if you've ever experienced a miracle in your own life. Is this something that you've seen, something that you've experienced? And as I was thinking about how I would teach this and inviting you to tell a story, I was like, well, I can't think of any miracles in my life. They don't come to mind right away. And then I started thinking about it more. And I remember I was living in Atlanta, and Atlanta has this interstate that goes all around the city. It was raining really hard that day. And I was probably driving faster than I should have. I was on a rush on the way to the airport. And all of a sudden, the car started experiencing like that sliding you're feeling when the water hits. And on the dashboard, I saw a light pop up, a light I'd never seen in the car before, but it suggested to me that the car was kind of taking over. My friends, I looked very carefully at that dashboard later, and there is no light. It doesn't exist. I don't know how to make sense of what happened in that moment. Or I thought about this other moment. I was serving as a hospital chaplain in a hospital. And I should say that I grew up speaking Spanish as my first language. I learned English when I went to kindergarten. I was 5 years old. But I know how to speak Spanish. So my chaplaincy supervisor was with me, and he said, there's this couple. They've lost a pregnancy. They only speak Spanish. Can you go talk to them? And here I am, like 22, 23, have no idea even where to begin. But also I walked in there and realized I wasn't not sure, not just what to say, but how to say it. So if I go to Latin America, if I go back home to Puerto Rico, I can order a meal, I can talk to people in everyday language. But I started going to school in English when I was 5 years old. So all my technical language, all my theological language is mostly in English. So I'm sitting there, I have no idea what these folks are going through. I have no idea how to communicate it to them. And I just started talking. And I spoke words in Spanish that I thought I had forgotten, more words that I never knew I'd learned in the first place. It felt like a miracle in that moment. I was speaking with abilities I didn't know I had. all that to say is that I imagine that we would share these stories too in our midst, stories of things that we cannot explain, things that have happened to us. But also, if we spend some time thinking about healing stories and exorcism stories, maybe you've seen a few of those on TV. Well, there's a church guy in the front and they're healing people and people are falling left and right. I know what I've experienced in my life. But when I see other things that people call miracles, I become very, very, very suspicious that it's all being made up. So we're caught between these two realities, that we've experienced things that we can't understand. And we know all too well that people lie and make things up in order to bring attention to themselves or also develop power. So how do we make sense of this tension in our lives when we're reading these stories, these extraordinary stories of what Jesus has done? I think there's at least two ditches for us to avoid when we're thinking about these miracle stories. On the one ditch is that we require some willful naivete on all our parts. That when it comes to the Bible, when it comes to the Gospels, when it comes to church, maybe the rest of the week you think, but not here. We refuse to think and ask questions about these stories. That's a ditch I desperately want to avoid because it's such a bifurcated way of moving through the world. It's also not a faithful way of reading these texts. It may seem faithful, but it deeply is not. On the other ditch is a ditch that is as dangerous. A ditch where we try to explain away all the miracles that we find in the New Testament. And especially 18th century and 19th century New Testament scholars were really, really good at this. So all those people with demon possessions, they're just people with mental health problems that Jesus kind of did some talk therapy with them and got them better. All those people who were sick, who Jesus made well, psychosomatic disease. We got this solved. We understand this. What that doesn't take seriously enough is that maybe here in lots of parts of the Western world, we think we know how to explain the world. We've got science. And also there are other parts of the world where people experience miracles and they know what demon possession looks like and they take it quite seriously. We can't just dismiss these experiences that others have had either. So between these two ditches, I think there's a better way of thinking about these miracles, a more faithful way of thinking about these miracles. And I think it's important we approach these because we've got the two ditches, but we also have some dangers along the way. It is too easy for us when we read the healing miracles to then project them upon people in our lives in a way that's quite destructive. Let me give you one example of this. That same hospital chaplain I was working with was this extraordinary chaplain who also has cerebral palsy. And he can walk, but also spends a lot of time in a wheelchair. And he told me a story once that he was, and that this would happen regularly at a post office or at the grocery store, that utter strangers would tap him on the shoulder and say, if you pray hard enough, you'd be able to leave that wheelchair behind. Then not knowing that he actually can walk. It's too easy for us when we read these healing narratives to assume we know what someone else's wholeness looks like. So instead of approaching it and wondering about these stories, we think there's a one-to-one correlation between my wellness and my faithfulness. And if there's something wrong with you, it's because you're not really faithful enough. It's a dangerous way to approach these texts. It's also quite dangerous to so easily associate, like those 18th and 19th century New Testament scholars did, mental health and demon possession. It's too easy for us to lump together an experience that many of us will experience of mental health challenges in our own lives, and associating that with demon possession just is far too dangerous, not nearly generous enough about the way that we know the world is. So we know all too well that there are many things we just don't understand in this world, things that are beyond our comprehension. We know that mysteries abound, and we know that fellow Christians around the world experience the supernatural and miracles in ways we may not fully understand, but we shouldn't just simply dismiss. So where are we left in all this? And I think where we can head is the question of imagination, about imagination. What if these stories aren't just simple one-to-one correlations between the ancient world and our world? What if the power of these stories is the way they sit in our imagination, sit in our heads and in our lives, and transform how we see the world? When we look around the world and we see all the things we struggle with, we see the forces of death around us, we see the forces of division. What if these stories are meant to evoke our imaginations to wonder what flourishing life might look like? Not to say that these are the only ways that flourishing life looks like, but ways to us imagine what that might look like for us. And so I think these stories are about experiencing salvation, seeing salvation, tasting salvation, experiencing salvation in our bodies in a way that's embodied, that's transformative, and that's present for us. So let's look at a couple of these examples. So this is what we do a lot in my classes at Princeton Seminary. We read the Bible a lot, so we'll do that together here. So first I want to take us to Luke chapter 4. So this is Jesus going back home to his local synagogue, as he often does. And the story goes like this, that when Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because she has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. She has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." This is Jesus' inaugural sermon, his first stepping out into public in the Gospel of Luke. And he goes into the synagogue, and the scroll is handed to him. And it's a scroll, not a codex like this. So he didn't get to go choose his perfect passage, right? The scroll is already set. It's established. This is the text that God has set for Jesus to read that day. And what he reads about, it's about this transformative salvation experience. Not one that happens when we die one day, not in some distant future, but today and right now. What does it look like? Good news is brought to the poor. The captives are released. The blind can see. The oppressed go free. Notice how tangible, how embodied, how relational all these promises are. These aren't wispy hopes about one day living forever. They are embodied, present hopes about what might happen today. Jesus reads this text, and he sits down, and everyone is expecting and wondering what Jesus is going to say. And he says, "Today this has been fulfilled in your hearing." Not tomorrow, not next week, not when I am crucified, not when I'm resurrected, not when I come back, but today this has been fulfilled in your hearing. And then what does Jesus do throughout the gospel but do precisely these things? Bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, heal people, and let the oppressed go free. So if we start with this as the guiding assumption of Jesus' ministry and life, that might help us bring to clear vision what these healings, what these exorcisms, what these feedings mean. They're about proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, about this Jubilee year in this present right now. The Spirit is upon me, Jesus says, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So right after this big inaugural sermon and the successful moment, Jesus does two things. Jesus exorcises a demon-possessed person, and he heals someone. The very first things that Jesus does is to demonstrate what healing and exorcism looks like. So first, Jesus went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath. They were astounded at his teaching because he spoke with authority. And that idea of speaking with authority is one I want us to dwell with and wonder, what does it mean when they say he spoke with authority? In the synagogue, there was a man who had the spirit of an unclean demon. And I always wondered, how bad does a demon have to be to not just be a regular demon, but an unclean demon? This poor guy. So there's a man who had the spirit of an unclean demon. And he cried out with a loud voice, "Let us alone. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The demons recognize Jesus' identity, and they recognize not just who Jesus is, but what Jesus might be able to do. The demon, like the crowds, recognize that he speaks with authority. We'll come back to that. Because they were astounded at his teaching because he spoke with authority. Now, I don't think this means that Jesus has some deep, gravelly voice like James Earl Jones, this CNN, right? I don't think it's about the quality of his voice, but about the effect his voice has. think one of the challenges for us in thinking about these stories of demon possession in the Bible is that, at least my mind always goes to the movie The Exorcist, and now like my imagination is ruined about this, right? It's something you see on a movie screen. It's something that you see in in a fantasy world. These things can't be real. But in this story and others, we start to think a little bit about what it means. What are these forces of demon possession? So these forces of demon possession are death-dealing forces dwelling in someone's body. We don't know where they've come from. We don't know how to repel them. We don't know how to send them away. And all they do is deal in death and destruction. And I wonder if there are forces like that in our world that we might think about. Are there forces in this world that invade communities and our lives? Forces whose origins we can't always trace, that no one seems to be able to send away, and all they do is deal in death and destruction. I can think of a whole list of isms that sound like that to me. The ways that we treat one another around questions of race and gender and sexual identity and gender identity. The way that these forces seem to come from nowhere and yet have this power over us. Maybe we can't imagine demon possession after the exorcist, but we can imagine what it's like to have these forces of death in our own lives. Maybe we can imagine what it would look like to have Jesus step into the middle of that and speak with this kind of authority. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." When the demon had thrown him down before them, he came out of him without having done him any harm. They were all amazed and kept saying to one another, "What kind of utterance is this? For with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and out they come." They're amazed not by the tenor of Jesus' voice, but by its power. But these forces that no one else can stop, these forces of death, these forces of evil, these forces of empires, power, these uncontrollable forces whose origins no one knows, that no one can expel, Jesus just speaks, and they go running. What might that look like in our midst? The clarity and power of Jesus' voice to send these forces fleeing, these forces that divide and harm us and kill us. What might that look like for us? Right after this, Jesus goes to Simon's house and performs the first healing miracle we see recorded in the Gospel of Luke. So after he leaves the synagogues, Jesus enters Simon's house. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked him about her. Then he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. Immediately she got up and began to serve them. And I just want us to notice that language that's used here. He stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. The very same language that Luke just used to talk about that unclean demon being rebuked is the very same language that is used here. Jesus rebukes the demon, and here Jesus rebukes the fever. Because at least in Luke's imagination, the forces of death that caused that fever, the forces of death that were embodied in that demon-possessed man are quite alike. They are these forces that tear us apart, that threaten our lives. And in both cases, Jesus' voice is enough. Jesus' voice has authority to send that illness away. And then notice what Mary does right after this is to get up and begin to serve them. One of the things I find so striking in these stories of both healing and exorcism throughout the Gospel of Luke is that they're never just about one person. I think we miss this so easily. It's not just about the sick person who's made well, the demon-possessed person who's now freed. It's about what that freedom, what that healing enables. It brings people back together. They're all these people with the illnesses and their demon possession keep them separated from their community. And Jesus' authority, Jesus' voice brings them back. It's not just them who are made well. It's a whole community who's made well. And there's a great example of this in Luke chapter 7. This is the famous story of the widow of Nain. So Jesus goes to this town called Nain. His disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was with his mother's only son, and she was a widow. And with her was a large crowd from the town. So imagine the scene. This town has seen one of their neighbors suffer these consecutive and terrible griefs, both losing a husband and now losing a child. And the community has circled around her, but you can imagine they don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to help. Maybe you've experienced this too, when you have someone in your life going through something terrible, and all you can do is linger with them, sit with them. They're there, they're filled with compassion, with empathy, but they don't know what to do. So when the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." One of the things I find so striking about this story is that this woman never asks Jesus for help. She never speaks. Instead, it's Jesus who sees her deep need, has compassion for her, and encourages her to leave her grief and come into this moment of life. I wonder if she was not in a place to ask Jesus for help. If she's in a place of such deep hopelessness, of such deep grief, then imagining that having her son back was just simply impossible for her. But Jesus sees right through her grief, right through her needs, and says to her, "Do not weep." Then Jesus came forward, touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. I love that line. Jesus gave him to his mother. We might be tempted to think that this is a story about a dead man who's made well. What if it's a story about a mother who's made whole? A mother who's lost so much, and Jesus gives him back to his mother. What if not just the dead man who's healed and not just the mother, but the whole community, that whole community that came out with her in grief, they too are healed when Jesus brings life. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on God's people." Encountering this moment of life, fear courses through them. Not the kind of fear that we experience at a horror movie, but the kind of awe that Pastor Scott was talking about this morning. This awe, this wonder that something that we haven't seen happen before is now happening. We cannot explain it. We don't know where it comes from, but we know it must have something to do with God. Additional stories. So we've talked about healings. We talked about exorcism. The last scene I want to talk about is the table. Jesus sends out the 12 disciples to go do Jesus things, to heal people, to exorcise demons. And they come back from their adventures and they say, "Jesus, you won't believe what happened. We were able to heal people. We exorcised demons." And Jesus is like, "Yeah, that's why I sent you out." He's not surprised by this. They're stunned. They're amazed. And they gather with Jesus. And as so often happens in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is trying to get away from the crowds to find some peace. But here the day is drawing to a close. The crowds have gathered around Jesus. Sick people and demon-possessed people, people looking for a word of life, have drawn all around Jesus. And it's at the end of the day, and the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away so that they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside to lodge and get provisions, for we are here in a deserted place." And I want us to dwell on that line there, "for we are here in a deserted place." In a second, we're going to learn that there are 5,000 men in this crowd, and an untold number of women and children as well. Thousands of people. And yet the disciples look around, and all they see is what they do not have. We are here in a deserted place. I remember what they were just doing. They were healing people. They were exorcising demons. They were proclaiming the gospel. They saw all these amazing, life-giving things happening through their hands. And they look around, and they see the 12 and all these thousands of people and their needs, and all they think is, we are here in a deserted place. But worst of all is that they're there with Jesus. They're there with this person that has provided so much life to so many people. And all they see is what they do not have. We are here in a deserted place. Their imaginations have to be reshaped by Jesus here. So Jesus said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people," which is ridiculous. We're not going to do that. But there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Make them sit down in groups of about 50 each." They did so and made them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate and were filled. What was left over was gathered up 12 baskets of broken pieces. Those 18th and 19th century scholars, they had a ready explanation for this story. They say, Jesus shared what little he had, these 5 loaves and 2 fish. And it turns out everybody in the crowd had a little bit of food in their pocket too. But they were worried that if they pulled out that little bit of food they had, somebody else would want it, and there would be just mass chaos. They were trying to protect themselves. So that the miracle isn't Jesus multiplying bread, it's a miracle of generosity, and the bread is multiplied, which is a nice little story, but I don't think that's what Luke is after here. It's about the possibilities of flourishing life. It's about the possibilities of looking around and seeing not what we don't have, but the very presence of Jesus in our midst. To me, this is a model story for how we might move through this world that feels so full of death and destruction and division. That's my struggle. Left to my own devices, I will look around and that's all I will see. What the Gospels might help us do is to imagine something different, to put on a new set of lenses, that we might see what happens when Jesus shows up in our midst and messes things up, stirs things up, and sets us all aflutter. So what if these stories about healings and about exorcisms, about multiplying of bread, they're not stories meant to measure our credulity or our faith. They're not tests that the gospel writers put in there to say, do you really believe this stuff? Because you have to believe in demons and you have to believe in healings. What if they're not tests of faith? What if these stories instead are meant to stir our imaginations, to wonder what is possible when Jesus shows up in our midst? What is possible when Jesus heals, when Jesus faces the demonic forces of this world and rebukes them, when Jesus feeds us in the wilderness? What if these stories are pictures of the flourishing of human life, meant not to stay on the pages of these gospel stories, but meant to walk with us as we move through this world that seems so riven and so full of these forces of death and destruction? What if these are sparks of imagination that we might notice little bits of life everywhere we go, and that without their help, we would miss along the way? There's one last story I want to share about in the Gospel of Luke. And that's this famous story of the road to Emmaus, which you might remember. It's in Luke 24. Jesus has died on the cross. His friends have seen him die in this gruesome form of torture meant for people who Rome thinks are threats. And so they display them in public to say to other people, don't be like this guy, because you'll end up on a cross like this. And there's word that's floating around, and the pastor talked about it this morning, about the women come back and say he's been risen. Luke says that the disciples thought it was an idle tale. They saw what they saw. They saw their friend breathe his last. They saw people put him in the ground. It cannot be true that he's alive. And so there's these 2 disciples leaving Jerusalem, heading towards Emmaus. Presumably they're leaving Jerusalem because they might be worried that they might be next in Rome's sights. If Rome is interested in providing more examples of what it means to oppose Roman power, they might be in danger. So they're walking along on this journey, and then Jesus shows up right next to them. And in a sentence that no English teacher I ever had would allow, Luke writes that their eyes were kept from recognizing him, using that passive voice that all English teachers hate. Their eyes were kept from recognizing. And I don't know why they don't recognize Jesus. Maybe he looks different after the trauma of the cross. Maybe the resurrected body looks different. Maybe Jesus is wearing a Zorro mask. I don't know. But for whatever reason, they don't recognize him. and they spend all day with him. And they hear him teaching. They smell him. They see his body. Maybe as they're walking, they put over and put their hand on his shoulder. He's with them all day. And they don't recognize him. They don't recognize him until they sit at a table that night. And Jesus gives them bread. All of a sudden, their eyes are open and they're amazed. And then Jesus disappears because he's got a flair for the drink. He disappears. Why do I tell that story? Because I wonder if in that moment when their eyes were open, it's not just a function of them being able to see Jesus, but that when their eyes were opened, they saw something in front of them that was there the whole time. The possibility of life. That despite empire's best efforts to keep this body down, they could not kill him. Despite the way that illness ravages us, it doesn't have the final word. Despite these forces that invade our communities and our bodies and our lives, they don't have all the power. So what if these stories are not tests for us, and they're not these old stories that we can simply put away on a shelf as old fairy tales? Whatever these powerful stories that help us open our eyes to what is possible when Jesus shows up. Thank you very much, friends. I think we have some time for some questions. Chat a little bit. If you've ever had questions, like you wanted to ask a Bible scholar, I'll try my best, and then I'll evade the hard questions. You'll see how good I am.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Barreto. So we are going to do question and answer time just a little differently than we have in the past. Folks, you may see a camera up here. We have our live stream folks joining us. And so we're asking that if you have a question, please come up to the mic so that not only the whole room can hear you, but also our folks at home. And folks at home, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in the webinar. If you click on that, you'll be able to type in a question, and Natalie Owens-Pike, who I hope you have met, will be asking those questions for you right up here at the microphone. So let's go ahead and get started.
I had a professor who always said, who would like to ask the second question?
I'll go ahead and get us started. Looking at Jesus's miracles, and I think often we think that, we don't see miracles like this now, but we wish we did.
Yeah.
How do we look at these miracles and see how God is working in our world today?
Yeah. One of the things that Jesus talks about in Luke chapter 4, he describes how the prophets of God went to unexpected people to heal them. So he talks about Elijah going to a foreign general to heal him. And he says there were lots of people in Israel who needed to be healed. And yet God sent God's prophet to this foreigner. And then Elisha, who went to this widow, this foreign widow, and provided her bread and food and saved their lives when there were so many widows in Israel that needed that help. And I think it's important to think about that as we think about these miracles, that there were probably many people with skin diseases that Jesus did not get to. Lots of people who died, who Jesus didn't bring back from the dead. Lots of demon-possessed people that he only had limited time. He could only get so far. Or even to think about the widow of Nain and her son that Jesus brought back. Presumably, he was going to die again. And so would this widow. And so would that whole community. That miracles aren't about things that happen all the time, even in Jesus' life, right? We see all these recorded miracles, so we imagine that he's just doling out miracles left and right. But they're kind of promises. They are sort of down payments on the power of the kingdom that's invading all around us. So that kingdom maybe isn't going to transform the world right here and right now in the way that we would expect, the way that we would wish, the way that I imagine many of us have hoped, sitting next to a loved one who is dying or who is sick. And yet the possibility is there for new life. And maybe it takes different shape than we had expected. And maybe it's something that we need more imaginations to see. But this expectation that life is always around the corner is one that I think can shape our everyday walk through this world. So it's not it's not just, it'd be much easier, right? If Jesus was able to touch every leper, heal every disease. And we were done with that. It's still a promise, but a promise that these instances demonstrate to us is a promise that will be kept and a promise that's real. And I know there are moments when that doesn't seem like it's enough. I have a colleague right now who's in her last days. And I confess to you that promise sometimes I'm like, that just doesn't seem like enough. It just doesn't seem fair. And yet I think that is part of the hope that my friend who is dying is embracing, this hope of seeing Jesus and also seeing the flourishing of life still in front of her. None of this stuff is easy. But I think that's the imagination that we're being called into wonder.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Owens-Pike. I am the Director of Ministry to the online campus, and we have some wonderful questions coming from folks online. Jack in St. Paul, Minnesota asks.
I used to live in St. Paul.
Oh, no kidding. Me too.
Oh, yeah. Near
It's a miracle.
Macroland, see? You know what it is, though? The Twin Cities, the center of the universe, apparently.
They truly are. Were you connected to McAllister?
We just live near there.
Okay, because I went to McAllister.
Maybe we're there at the same time.
Yes, we can chat. Well,
Hello,
Jack,
St. Paul.
thank you for getting us together on the St. Paul connection. And Jack asked this wonderful question, which I think picks up on the hope that you were just addressing with how your colleague is living right now and dying. And Jack asks, would you speak to the question of the importance of believing the miracles actually happened in order for them to have power in our lives?
That's a great question. So I think about, for example, there's a woman who breaks into a dinner party that Jesus is at. And she's in Luke, she's known as a sinner. And everybody knows what that means. And they're like, oh, she doesn't belong here. And Jesus says at the end, your faith has made you well. And I wonder what that means, because in that story, she never speaks. She never says a word. She just shows up in a place where she's not supposed to be. That sometimes faithfulness means showing up where you're not supposed to be. I think about the widow of Nain, who never speaks, maybe doesn't believe that her son can come back. And yet Jesus sees her needs and has compassion for her. Right before that story, it's a story about a centurion who wants his servant healed. And he says to Jesus, you don't even need to come to my house. I know what authority looks like. I know what power looks like. I know what it's like to run an army. Armies are great at pacifying people by threatening death. But I see something different in you. I see that your voice can bring life. And if you just speak the words, it will happen. So right next to each other is a story about a woman that cannot speak what she hopes, and a man who's willing to say anything at all in public. That maybe it's not just about whether or not we believe. Sometimes it does matter very much, right? To Jesus, your faith has made you well. But sometimes we, on our own, cannot hold that faith, that belief. Sometimes we need the help of others. And I wonder if that's what that crowd with the widow of Nain was doing, is that they're carrying her grief and her hopes when she cannot do that herself. So one of the things I think these stories can help us do is think about what it means for us as a community to hold one another when believing feels impossible. And that it's not a test of faith when we go through this stuff. But it is an opportunity for us to lean into others when we can't do this on our own. So I think it varies. Sometimes it matters very much if the person believes, and Jesus credits that to people and says, your faith has saved you. But sometimes I think people who don't have an ounce of faith left still receive that healing. It's not a one-to-one correlation, I think. So I hope that gets to that question, but it's a great question. And hello, St. Paul, Minnesota. Hopefully no snow yet over there.
Hi, Professor Barreto. I had a question about your views of whether the way you've been describing miracles and the way they're portrayed in the New Testament, it's mostly personal. Like for me, my personal miracle is when meeting my wife. For many reasons, that's a miracle. But can you also think of miracles as being more systemic?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, like, I'm thinking about, compared to Jesus's time, healthcare is so much better. I mean, there are gaps, obviously, and there's inequality, but people live much longer and much healthier lives now because of advancements in medicine and science. Their literacy rates are much higher now, generally. People are, I mean, again, there's been setbacks, but people, I think, now are less racist and less sexist than they were. Certainly in Jesus's time, and even, in the last 50 years during my lifetime. So can you think of those as being miracles?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I even think, I was thinking about this recently in the earliest days of the pandemic, when the promise of the vaccine was out there. I remember I was like, that doesn't happen that fast. It just doesn't happen. And I remember seeing news coverage, I think it was in New Jersey, of this nurse who was the first person who got vaccinated in the state. And that felt like a miracle, that something could happen so fast and so effectively. So I do think there are these moments when extraordinary things happen. That's not, me driving in the car by myself and the light is flashing, but incredible moments when people come together and work towards life. My friend Heath Carter, who teaches at Princeton Seminary, talks a lot about social movements led by Christians in the 19th century, especially. And one of the things that he talked about and heard in another lecture is, if you're an abolitionist pre-Civil War, and somebody in a time machine comes and goes, in the next couple of decades, slavery will end in this country. Even the abolitionists probably aren't believing that. They think probably it's generational, long-term work, that it won't happen in their own lifetimes. Sometimes miraculous things happen in history that lead to the flourishing of life. I think that's absolutely the case. So one of the things I think that these healing narratives can help us think about is, again, not just the individual effects of these healings, but what they do to these larger communities. So whether it's a woman with the issue of blood who is healed, or this woman who's called a sinner, or this widow who's lost her son, they're losing not just something for themselves, but what if the communities around them have lost something when the widow is in grief, when this dead man is dead, when this woman who's a sinner is not stitched into this community, she's excluded. When this woman with the issue of blood suffers not just in her body, but in her physical and relational connections. What if Jesus is not just fixing one person, but fixing the whole community around them, because that community was not the community God wanted them to be, as long as this person couldn't be a part of it. One other place I can think about this too is around disability activists and the work that they've done to say to public spaces, it's not that we need to be made well, it's that this building needs to be accessible to us, right? The problem isn't us. The problem is the spaces that we've created. So sometimes I think the shape of those miracles is for us to redirect our attention to the people we think need our help, to ourselves, to imagine how we've architected a world where people need help, when actually we can imagine a different world. I think that conversion of the imagination is itself a sort of miracle as well in our midst. Still a long way to go. Churches were very specifically exempted from the Americans with Disability Acts, which is quite a witness that we bore to the world at that moment. But I know many churches have gone beyond the law to do what is actually true in faith. Okay, great question. Please.
There seems to be a little bit of tension when we hear about Jesus' ability to perform these miracles, which seems so easy and just through speaking. Yeah. At the same time, also, we see these huge needs which are not met. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about and grapple with the tension between those two? When you think about these wide range of needs that we might feel passionate about, should be met and doesn't seem to be addressed.
No, absolutely. It's a great question. And look, we're out of time again. I'm sorry. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's a great question. I think I want to think about it a couple of ways. One, is that I had it and it went, where did it go? I'm gonna get it again. One is that it's partly this sense. Oh yeah, this is where I wanted to go. It seems easy to Jesus, right? And it actually, sometimes people just touch the edge of his cloak and they get better. Like he can't even control this life-giving force that's within him. So like I said, there are lots of people who are dying in Judea as Jesus is walking around. Lots of people who are sick, who are not made well. So I wonder, part of what these miracles help the people then in that moment is it's change their sense of expectation, but also perhaps shift their sense of what our obligations are one to another. Right? So it's not just for us to wait for a miracle to happen, but the possibilities of inclusion and embrace that these people experience when they're healed, maybe they didn't need to be healed in order to be embraced and loved in that community in that moment. And maybe these stories also redirect our attention away from Jesus' easy healing of that person to what happens when that person is reconstituted back into that community. So maybe that's another aspect. I think the tension is right. And I don't know how to resolve that, right? Because as I said, I wish, I wish things were different for my friend, for my colleague, for all these people that who are suffering. But I wonder if part of the shift in our imaginations is what is actually in our control, what's actually possible for us. And maybe it's not quite as easy as Jesus touching somebody and they're made well, but maybe it's not quite as hard as we had imagined in the first place to be a place of life-giving hope. Yeah. It's a great question, and that was an inadequate response, but at least a place to start. Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate it. Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Barreto. That was extremely enlightening and I do think our detectives of divinity we were detecting more being able to detect the divine this fall. Thank you all for joining us. This has been a wonderful start to our adult education programming for the year. Thank you all on live stream for joining us as well. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Again, at the back of the room, there is a flyer that has all of the adult ed events coming up September and October. Next week's is online only. So please, people who are here as well, join us. You can register on the website. Folks at home, obviously, please join us. And then on October 1st, we will have an organ tour with Dr. Ryan Jackson. So if you haven't had a chance to do that yet, please do join. It is cool, right? All right. So thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your day.